Hello and welcome to Godzilla, King of the Monsters, starring Raymond Burr with new scenes directed by Terry Morse. My name is Ed Godziszewski.
And hello, my name is Steve Ryfle.
Outside of Japan, this is what was known to the world as the first Godzilla film for many decades. In fact, many people had no idea that there were two very different versions of this film. And some people even thought that Raymond Burr had gone to Japan himself to film these scenes.
It's undoubtedly one of the most famous and enduring monster movies of all time. This was first released in the United States in 1956, and it continues to air on television regularly to this day. In fact, in recent years, it's been showing on the American Movie Classics channel, which is somewhat ironic given the movie's dubious critical reputation.
And the fact that it is a Japanese movie.
That's right. Well, we'll be talking about that reputation and whether or not it's justified. And we'll also talk about how and why Godzilla came to be quote-unquote Americanized for release abroad. We'll talk about Raymond Burr's involvement. We'll discuss some of the differences between the two versions and what effect they might have had on the anti-nuclear theme that was so prevalent in Ishiro Honda's version. And later on, we're going to be joined in the studio by a special guest, Terry Morse Jr., so stick around. This is going to be a lot of fun.
A lot of critics point out that this version is inferior to the original, which is true, but the US version really does deserve a lot of credit for bridging the gap between Ishiro Honda's film, which is told from a Japanese viewpoint, and the atomic monster genre that was so popular back in the 1950s in America. This version was responsible for launching Godzilla's popularity around the world much more so than the Japanese version. So the question is, how did Godzilla get to Hollywood?
He was discovered by a handful of very savvy Hollywood men who knew a moneymaker when they saw one and how to exploit it. So let's rewind, if we can, back to 1955 in our minds, just a few months after Godzilla was released in Japan back in November of '54. So at that time, Japanese movies were starting to get their first international exposure. Kurosawa's Rashomon, Kinogasa's Gate of Hell, and other Japanese movies were winning prizes at film festivals around the world. And then the Toho company, which had created Godzilla, sensed that perhaps an international market for Japanese films was opening up. So in order to capitalize on that trend, Toho opened an office in the Little Tokyo section of downtown Los Angeles to sell foreign rights to some of their films. And meanwhile, across town in Hollywood, there was this entire subculture of exploitation movie makers who were operating independently, kind of in the shadows of the big movie studios. Have you seen Ed Wood?
Yes, I have.
Yeah, the Tim Burton film. If you've seen that, you have an idea of what the climate was like in Hollywood at that time, at this sort of strata of the movie business. Remember the scene where Ed is telling the low-budget producer about his burning desire to make this personal film about cross-dressing, and the guy tells him, I don't make movies like that, I make crap.
Yes, indeed. We're talking about the Samuel Z. Arkoffs, Roger Cormans, and Burt I. Gordons of the world, who were behind classics like The Amazing Colossal Man, Reform Schoolgirl, She Creature, and even minor gems like The Monolith Monsters and It the Terror from Beyond Space, and fun bad movies like Robot Monster. The scene we're watching now is the first example of how Burr interacts with the main characters of the Japanese version. Burr's insertion into the scene is actually very smoothly handled, and if you didn't know any better, it'd be easy to think that this was just as it was originally shot. But with 50 years of hindsight, you can actually spot some of the telltale signs of specially inserted scenes. Notice how all the other characters, who are supposedly Japanese, generally do their best to hide their faces from the camera. The nurse keeps her back turned and hides the couple that she's caring for, and that couple averts their faces. A body double wearing clothes that are similar to Emiko's and filmed from the back is used to create the illusion that Burr is speaking together with Emiko. You can actually see that her shirt bears only the vaguest resemblance to Emiko's, but by and large on the first viewing the substitution is pretty effective. The only real giveaway is that something isn't quite right with what you see when Emiko is speaking. Her sightline is looking straight ahead and not down where Steve would be.
There's never one scene in the entire movie where Raymond Burr's face and the face of one of the Japanese cast members is seen in the same shot. Also, this is the first of only two simulated face-to-face conversations that Raymond Burr has with the Japanese cast members in the entire movie. Every other time he talks to one of the characters from the original film, and there really are very few instances of that. It's done with body doubles whose faces are, pretty much totally obscured to hide the fact that it's a cheat. But we should probably just add that this film was made long before the age of DVD and really wasn't meant to be necessarily watched over and over again and picked apart.
With half a century of hindsight, it's easy to go back and point these things out, and that's part of what we're trying to do here, but it's not meant as a criticism, because the film really needs to be judged based on what it was at the time that it came out, and it was intended to bring this movie, a film that was only accessible to the Japanese audience, to an American audience. So certain things had to be done, and it was actually quite ingenious what they did.
If you really think about it, Raymond Burr actually spends almost the entire movie lying in a hospital bed, and that's because, unlike the Japanese version in which the story unfolds chronologically, this version is told in flashback, and the story really begins with Steve remembering the events of the past few days. There are actually some advantages to this approach. For one thing, the movie feels like a news report, and so it actually reinforces the documentary feel that was already present in the original version. But more importantly, by having Raymond Burr narrate the story in flashback, the filmmakers are creating the illusion that Steve Martin is the protagonist, when in fact he's nothing more than a spectator and a narrator. Never once do Steve Martin's actions propel the drama, nor does he ever react to any of the action going on around him in any way other than watching and describing it. So through this technique of flashback, and also by using body doubles for the Japanese cast, the filmmakers created the illusion that Raymond Burr was a member of the cast, and it worked. None of the reviewers writing about the film back in its heyday ever detected this sleight of hand.
This scene establishes early on that Steve Martin is a friend of Dr. Serizawa. Terry Morse and his co-writer devised a very clever way to explain how Steve knows all the principles of the story, and it gives him a good excuse for being in all the right places throughout the film at just the right time.
On the other hand, I think you could also say that this is the most pointless of all the newly inserted scenes, because we already know that Steve Martin is here to meet his friend Serizawa. He told us that when he was on the plane, so that information is a repeat. The real purpose of this scene is to set up the fact that Serizawa is busy and he's going to keep blowing Steve Martin off. So this kind of shows how difficult Terry Morse's job was. He had very little footage from the original film that could be used to quote-unquote fake a conversation with Raymond Burr, including nothing with Dr. Serizawa. So using a friendship between two characters who we never see together as the setup for an entire plot is a bizarre screenwriting choice, but I must admit that this only occurred to me after seeing this film for about 50 times.
I represent United World News.
Let's talk a little bit about Raymond Burr. No matter whether you think this movie's a bastardization or a classic, I think it's clear that Raymond Burr's presence is a major reason for its success. Burr wasn't a major star yet at this time, but he was a name and a recognizable character actor who gave this movie more credibility than a B-movie star, say, like John Agar, who was a regular in 50s monster movies.
Raymond Burr is well known to people in America for playing Perry Mason from 1957 to 1966 on TV, a role that he won 2 Emmys for. But he began his Hollywood career as a character actor, playing the heavy in films like Meet Danny Wilson from 1952, in which he co-starred with Frank Sinatra, and of course for Hitchcock's famous Rear Window in 1954, in which he played the wife dismembering villain with the bleach blonde hair. This scene, where the frantic families are pushing their way through the door to the Nankai shipping line's map room, introduces the narrative device of Tomo interpreting for Steve. It was obviously shot on a set designed to match the Japanese footage. Duplicate sets are used throughout the film, with the exception of a few scenes, in order to put Burr into the middle of the action. Whether he's watching news conferences, taking notes at meetings, or interviewing people on Odo Island, or narrating Godzilla's attack on Tokyo from a window, Burr's a really lucky reporter. He just seems to be hanging around in the right place at the right time in order to get the story. And this isn't really unlike director Honda's other science fiction films, where reporters also play key roles. Journalists naturally ferret out the details of a big event, and they position themselves to be on hand so that they can get the big scoop.
Yeah, but the difference is that in a film like Godzilla vs. the Thing or Ghidorah, the reporter character, takes action and propels the story forward. Steve Martin's strictly an observer, and he's certainly no Woodward or Bernstein.
The fact that much of the dialogue remains in Japanese, such as the shipping company officials talking about the sunken ships, lends a certain air of realism to the film. And if you really think about it, everyone should not be speaking English. This is Japan, after all, and there's supposed to be a language barrier. This may have also been a cost-cutting decision on the part of the American filmmakers. The fewer the scenes that need to be dubbed, the lower the budget. But it all makes perfect sense, and for American audiences back in the 1950s who probably didn't know any Japanese, this would have, helped them to identify with Steve Martin's situation. You can actually believe that he's there in Japan. For scenes where it's impossible to have Steve Martin and his translator Tomo on the sidelines in order to tell us what's going on, as with some of the conversations we're going to be seeing between the Japanese cast later in the film, those scenes were dubbed into English.
A lot of people claim to have been the person who discovered Godzilla, but there was really only one man who could prove it. His name was Edmund Goldman, and he was at that time the owner of a small film distributorship called Manson International. Goldman had worked for Universal Pictures in China before World War II, and during the war he was taken prisoner by the Japanese. So he was interested in movies from that part of the world, and one day he happened to knock on Toho's door, inquiring about their product. Now, I interviewed Edmund Goldman back in 1995, a few years before he died, and he showed me the contract that he signed with Toho on September 27 of 1955, in which he purchased all rights to Godzilla in the United States and Canada for 5 years for the sum of $25,000, which was a pretty low price even back in those days. Right now I'd like to play actually an excerpt from an interview that I did with Edmund Goldman back then and let him explain how the deal came together.
Well, it was screened for me by the Toho people here. They had an office here. They were sending most of their films that they thought were suitable for the American market, and I was probably the only one that was dealing with them. I asked to see it because I saw the advertising on it and it looked interesting. So when I screened it, I thought there might be a possibility. I didn't know at the time that it was going to be dubbed into English and that Raymond Burr was going to be in it. I just thought it might be something that we could put subtitles. I had no idea how it was going to be released, but it turned out a lot better than I expected.
Dr. Yamane, Japan's leading paleontologist, was among the top scientists involved.
Right now, Raymond Burr is doing what he does best, watching the Japanese characters. We've just been introduced to the character of Dr. Yamane for the first time, but you might notice that this scene, where Yamane is supposedly being asked by the government what may be causing the disasters, this scene actually occurs much later in the Japanese version. If you listen carefully to the Japanese dialogue, you can hear Dr. Yamane say Gojira, or Godzilla, but in this version, the scene was rewritten as a way of getting the characters to Odo Island. In fact, in this version, the word Godzilla won't pop up until quite a bit later. In May of 1957, about a year after it came out in the United States, Toho released this version of the film in Japan in English with Japanese subtitles. It would have been fun to see the reaction of the Japanese moviegoers back then, because the movie must have seemed very strange to them. This scene would have been particularly weird because the scene originally occurred later in the film. The Japanese dialogue is totally different than what Raymond Burr's translator is saying. And also, for some reason, Toho decided to release the movie in scope, even though it's not a scope movie. So when the picture was blown up to fill the wider frame, it caused the top and the bottom of the frame to be cropped out. So in some scenes, the top of Raymond Burr's and Godzilla's head looked like they'd been chopped off. Here the Odo Islanders find Masaji, one of their own people who survived the shipping disasters. Burr's narration makes it seem like Masaji does not survive in this scene. And it's hard to say if this is intentional or if it was just an oversight on the part of the filmmakers. The fact is that it's not extremely obvious that the rescued Masaji is the same character who appears later. And the scene where the Japanese reporter Hagiwara interviews Masaji is almost completely cut. And it's replaced with Raymond Burr interviewing a cheaply dressed Asian guy wearing Woolworth's finest 10-cent straw coolie hat, and who speaks the most terrible and unnatural Japanese you can imagine.
The original Japanese film was about 98 minutes long, but this version is only about 80 minutes long. There's so much new stuff with Raymond Burr that less than an hour of the original footage was used. In this sequence here, the scenes of the Odo Islanders pulling their empty fishing nets and the old man's warnings about the legend of Godzilla were cut out. So in Ishiro Honda's version, Godzilla is this mythical beast, but in this version, he's not all that much different than the other 50s radioactive monsters.
It's kind of odd that we see the Japanese reporters getting off the chopper, but not Raymond Burr. It just shows you what a difficult task the American filmmakers had to sustain the illusion of Burr's involvement in the picture. The Japanese footage didn't always provide an easy way to insert Burr into the scene, and this was a very low-budget production, so they really couldn't rent a helicopter or build one on a soundstage.
I think for the most part, the makers of this American version were respectful to Japan and the Japanese. Remember that this is only a decade after World War II, and back in the 40s, it was not uncommon for Japanese soldiers to be depicted in the movies as these buck-toothed homicidal maniacs, but Steve Martin treats the Japanese as no better or worse than himself, and I think I also appreciate the fact that the extras who appear in the various scenes with Raymond Burr are Asians, so the filmmakers didn't pull a Charlie Chan and have white people playing Asian roles like Mickey Rooney in Breakfast at Tiffany's. The only part of the movie where I cringe a little bit is this sequence where Steve Martin is interviewing your favorite actor, Ed, the guy with the coolie hat. Here's the scene where Steve Martin learns about the legend of Godzilla, and there's an interesting piece of trivia here. The Asian man who's sitting in front of Steve, the guy with the headband and wearing the black kimono with the white Japanese writing on the collar, our friend and film archivist Oki Miyano tells us that the actor Key Luke wears that very same robe in a movie made 10 years before, in 1945, a war movie called First Yank into Tokyo. Oki says that he recognized this robe, and he's sure it's the same one because those Japanese characters on the collar read Lucille Anderson. Although he says he doesn't have any idea why. So apparently Key Luke and this guy got their wardrobe from the same closet. And coincidentally, Key Luke would do voiceover work for some of the later Toho monster movies. One thing I've noticed about this scene ever since I was a child is the rather odd way the word Godzilla is overdubbed. Godzilla! You know, I guess it's supposed to be the old man saying it, but it sounds like this disembodied voice that comes out of nowhere.
They believe their Godzilla is responsible for all these ship disasters? They're certain of it.
Well, here's Steve Martin smoking in bed, the recipe for disaster. But, well, you know, this is the 50s, and smoking in films was quite as natural as anything in those days.
And seeing them laying in that tent, I am tempted to make a Brokeback Mountain joke, but I won't.
Good, thank you.
There are two new special effects scenes, so to speak, that were added for the American version. One of them is this typhoon scene where Steve Martin and Tomo almost get blown away. And the other one occurs later on when Godzilla crushes a building and a bunch of debris falls on Raymond Burr's head.
There's one more actor inserted into the film who gets significant screen time, and that's Frank Iwanaga, who plays a security official, Tomo Iwanaga, who acts as Steve Martin's interpreter. Frank Iwanaga was a Los Angeles insurance salesman, a part-time actor, and a former USC track and field star who had played Japanese soldiers in World War II pictures during the early 1950s. In Ishiro Honda's film, there was a dark irony in the fact that Masaji, the man rubbing his head here, survived the shipping disasters and washed ashore only to have Godzilla virtually hunt him down again. And in this version, that irony is pretty much lost because Steve Martin told us he was dead. Unless you watch the film several times, you might not notice it's the same person who was washed ashore a while ago. But this scene plays with a sense of style and horror, and it's certainly effective enough to send at least one little kid running to hide under the covers when watching the film late at night for the first time.
Was that you?
That was me, yes. You'll also notice that several of Godzilla's roars are added in this scene, which again removes any doubt that it's a monster at work here. It's another change that makes the film seem more like an American monster movie of the time, with a more direct storytelling style than Honda's version, which took a more subtle and dramatic approach. We talked about Edmund Goldman, the man who discovered Godzilla, but when he bought the rights to Godzilla, he really didn't know what to do with it. But the fact remained that this was a Japanese language movie, and there was no way you could release it to a mass audience across the US at that time. This was, after all, just a little over a decade since the end of World War II, but even above and beyond what the American public might have felt toward Japan back then, the language barrier and the fact that the cast was entirely foreign presented a major obstacle.
Yeah, so what Edmund Goldman did was he turned for help to two guys, Harold Ross and Richard Kay, who had produced a number of low-budget adventure movies under the banner of their company Jewel Enterprises. That's Jewel with two L's, by the way. Their biggest hit at that time was a movie called Untamed Women that was released in '52, and it was about soldiers who were stranded on an island inhabited by cave ladies. That must have been fun. Edmund Goldman said it was Harold Ross and Richard Kay who came up with the idea to insert an American protagonist into the story and recut the film around that new character.
Well, I approached them on that because I was only interested in distribution of films abroad mostly. This was a new field for me. I wasn't in the business of distributing films in the United States, so I knew them on the basis of some business we had done previously, and I contacted them. I showed them the film, and they saw the possibilities. It was all their idea to dub it into English and to get the services of Raymond Burr. And I don't think they realized at the time what a big thing they had in their hands and what the potential was.
Each of the natives of Odo Island told his own story of the sudden...
Well, Ross and Kay needed money to finance this project, so they turned to one of their colleagues on the East Coast, a man named Joseph E. Levine. Now, years later, Joe Levine would become a very successful and well-known producer whose credits would include The Graduate and A Bridge Too Far and many, many other movies. So Joe Levine paid $100,000 for essentially a 50% interest in the movie.
Levine brought himself into it. Well, he saw the film, and he was a very good showman. He was very successful with almost anything he took on, even though they weren't very good pictures at the time. He was known as $100,000 Levine. He paid $100,000 for everything he was interested in.
Prints of snowmen have been found.
Now today, with movies routinely costing $100 million, it might not sound like a lot of money, but Joe Levine was really gambling when he spent $100,000 on this movie. That price tag was 4 times what Edmund Goldman had originally paid for the rights, and it was about half the entire Japanese production budget for Godzilla, but Joe Levine's gamble paid off, and it was his effort, particularly in publicizing the film, that had a lot to do with its success.
I'm going to pick up your money. I'll see you later. It seems to me there are still forces left in this world that none of us can understand.
Here we see Burr having a conversation with the back of Dr. Yamani's head. The guy who's playing Takashi Shimura's body double doesn't really seem to get the idea that he should act as if he's talking with Burr. He never looks up or even moves his head at all to make it look as if he was speaking. It seems like he just is staring at the wall or at Burr's chest. This actor's resemblance to Takashi Shimura is slim at best, and mainly because he looks so much more gaunt than Shimura. After I see a scene like this, it's amusing to think how the casting call must have gone for all the body doubles. They're calling in all these Oriental people that they can find, and then rather than look at their faces, the casting director has them all turn around so we can look at the backs of their heads. It really must have been a pretty bizarre scene.
Maybe they all belong to the Backwards Screen Actors Guild. It's kind of remarkable that the new footage with Raymond Burr blends into the Japanese footage as well as it does, because the style of cinematography is actually quite different. Ishiro Honda and his cameraman, Masao Tamai, favored wider camera angles that show all the cast members in a particular scene, a master shot followed by the usual close-ups. But the American version director, Terry Morse, and his cameraman, Guy Rowe, they rely heavily on close-ups and medium shots of Raymond Burr and the various extras, as you'll notice in this scene here on the boat. This was probably out of necessity because it appears that most of the sets that were built for this version were very small, such as this one, which is basically just a wall with a porthole on it. The only set that Raymond Burr appears in with any sense of size or dimension is probably the newsroom and perhaps Tomo Iwanaga's office.
Joe Levine was known in those days for having a flair for exploitation, and it was a fellow named Terry Turner that worked for Levine who supposedly came up with the idea of calling Godzilla the King of the Monsters, which is obviously meant as a challenge of sorts to the throne of King Kong. Incidentally, though, that was not the original title of the movie. The initial announcement in Variety, the Hollywood trade newspaper, said the movie was going to be called Godzilla the Sea Beast. But obviously they changed their minds. Joe Levine's people also got Steve Allen to mention Godzilla King of the Monsters on The Tonight Show, and back in those days, that was huge.
If you look at some of the publicity materials that Joe Levine created for this film back in those days, it's really interesting to note the colorful language and the way they stretched the truth to get people interested. They said Godzilla made The Creature from the Black Lagoon and The Thing and King Kong all seem like, quote, Peter Pan by comparison. And they said the film was made entirely on location in Japan. And I really like the way they described the actress playing Emiko as, quote, the willowy, almond-eyed beauty Momoko Kochi, whose romance with a naval officer has a direct bearing on the monster's eventual destruction. The man who got the job of filming Raymond Burr's scenes and putting it all together as a new film was Terry Morse, a veteran film editor who had also directed a number of movies. Terry Morse, who was born in 1906 and died in 1984, began his career at First National, where he edited a lot of B-movie crime thrillers. He was promoted to director, but he was given the same type of lowbrow movies to work on. So he wasn't satisfied with that situation, and he went independent in the 1940s and worked steadily as an editor and director for about 2 decades.
Everybody, please stay back.
Other than Godzilla King of the Monsters, Terry Morse's best-known films as a director are probably a B-movie thriller called Fog Island from 1945, or British Intelligence starring Boris Karloff. He also directed 2 Charlie Chan pictures that starred Sidney Toler.
Don't hold it in your bare hands. What does that mean? It's a fabulous discovery.
So when the panic scene starts here, Tomo tells Steve it's safer up in the hills. It wasn't until I saw the Japanese version years later as an adult that I realized these villagers aren't really running away.
That's right. Tomo's line doesn't quite jive with what we see from the crowd in the original footage here. Everybody's carrying their own weapons to run up the hill and fight off the intruder. But fact is that Tomo's line does play into the audience's expectation, which is that you run to higher ground for safety whenever there's danger. This scene is extended a little bit by reusing footage of the head peering over the hill and roaring to make it look like not only is Godzilla roaring at Emiko, but then also at Steve Martin, which makes him seem like he's in danger as well as the Japanese cast.
Yeah, director Terry Morse did a pretty good job here of integrating Raymond Burr's scenes, which were shot on an indoor soundstage, with the Japanese location footage. And the way Tomo falls down and Steve helps him up, and that's intercut with Emiko falling and being rescued by Ogata. By mirroring the actions of the characters, Morse creates the illusion that they're all in the same scene together. This is yet another sequence where Steve has no direct interaction with any member of the principal Japanese cast, but because of little creative techniques like this, you might not even notice. Let's face it, if you went to see this movie at a theater back in 1956, you came to see the monster. And Raymond Burr's job is to string the audience along and keep you interested until Godzilla rises out of the ocean and goes berserk in the third act. And I have to give the filmmakers a lot of credit for making a film that has withstood the test of time. They were doing something, unprecedented, taking a foreign language movie and creating an entirely new version of it that still, is a reasonable facsimile of the original. And even now, 50 years later, in this age of director's cuts, Godzilla King of the Monsters, it's pretty much a rare case. And how many movies exist in 2 versions that are so vastly different from one another? The examples that are usually given are things like Touch of Evil and Blade Runner and The Big Sleep, but I think this film has many more and more drastic differences between the 2 cuts. I suppose the best comparison is something like the last Exorcist movie, which was completely reshot, or perhaps the Richard Donner version of Superman 2, if that ever sees the light of day. But After the success of Godzilla King of the Monsters, this type of revamping was tried again on several other Japanese monster movies in the 50s and 60s. The biggest examples, of course, are King Kong vs. Godzilla, or Gigantus, or Varan, or the first Gamera film.
Of course, there's Godzilla 1985, which was essentially done the same way 30 years later, but with new scenes consisting of Burr and a bunch of American military guys who sit around watching Japan get destroyed on a big screen TV.
A cross between the land-living and the sea-living animal.
There's a bit of controversy, real or imagined, that's followed this film for years. Some film critics and writers are convinced that Joseph E. Levine and Terry Morse and everyone who adapted Godzilla for the American market had a secret Cold War-era agenda, and that they purposely whitewashed the anti-nuclear weapons theme, either because they were afraid of offending the movie-going public or because they took personal offense at the movie's politics. One of the first writers that I know of who articulated this conspiracy theory, if you want to call it that, was Danny Perry in a book called Cult Movies 2 that was published in 1983. And Danny Perry accuses the American producers of making, quote, deletions that arouse suspicions regarding the covering up of references to damage done by the A-bomb. Well, it certainly is true that lots of references to nuclear weapons and lines of dialogue connecting Godzilla and the bomb were edited out of this movie. This scene is a particularly good example of what effect those cuts had. After Dr. Yamane's speech, where he reveals his theory that Godzilla was spawned by hydrogen bomb tests, a pompous senator stands up and declares that this information should be kept secret to avoid a crisis of international relations, and then a heated argument starts among the politicians. It's one of the best moments in the original film because it hints at rage and disgust over the Hiroshima and Nagasaki bombings in Japan at the time. But in this version, we just get a few seconds of the politicians arguing with no dialogue translation. So if you were watching this film in 1956, all you would know is that the government is panicking under pressure.
Another interesting note about this scene, Yamane says the Jurassic period occurred 2 million years ago. Shigeru Koyama, the original story writer, also made the same mistake in his story, and it was filmed that way in the Japanese version and now again in the American version. Nobody bothered to check their science textbooks. Yamane also says here that Godzilla is 400 feet tall, which is about 2.5 times as big as he really is.
Other than Steve Martin and Tomo, there are only 4 speaking roles that were added for the American version. Serizawa's assistant, the guy in the coolie hat, your friend Ed, the police officer at the airport, and now Raymond Burr's editor, George Lawrence of United World News. Playing this role is an obscure actor named Michael Conrad, that's Michael spelled M-I-K-E-L, who probably got the part because he'd been in the movie Untamed Women by the same producers a few years before. According to the Internet Movie Database, Michael Conrad started out as a Universal International contract player in the late 40s, and his real claim to fame is an independent film called The Flying Saucer, which he wrote and directed and starred in. So finally, Steve and his good friend Serizawa speak to one another here, 30 minutes into the movie. You notice how the footage of Serizawa is used here. It looks like he's getting up to answer the phone, but in fact, that snippet is taken from a later scene where Emiko rings his doorbell. I like how Serizawa pokes fun at Raymond Burr's bad Japanese here, too.
Yeah, while Burr may have been a very well-respected actor and one who read his lines pretty well, he certainly didn't display any knack for Japanese, as his stilted delivery here shows. But, that isn't really important to the scene, which is intended to establish his relationship with Serizawa and therefore give him a personal awareness of the love triangle. It's actually a pretty well-thought-out way to make him privy to the personal lives of the people who will determine the fate of the world. The body double for Serizawa is definitely the best one that's utilized in this film. By partially obscuring him with the lab paraphernalia and dressing him in a lab coat and putting on the eye patch, you can easily believe that this is Akihiko Hirata speaking with Burr.
It's good to have you home, Dr. Serizawa.
It is good to be back.
Japanese monster movies and Hong Kong action movies have been the butt of jokes for many years because of their dubbing. Even when the dubbing is pretty good, and sometimes it's done very well, people think it's laughable because the lip movements are out of sync. A typical way to dub a film was called looping, because the actors would record their dialogue in short passages called loops, and they would project the scene on the screen over and over and over again, and the actors would keep repeating the dialogue until they got a decent take. But the dubbing on Godzilla King of the Monsters was done in an even more primitive way than that. One day in late 1955, there were advertisements in the Hollywood Reporter and Daily Variety announcing an audition in Little Tokyo. There were a few details about the job, but the ad said the production company was looking for Asian actors, and this turned out to be a casting call for the background extras and also for the voice actors who dubbed the dialogue for the Japanese actors.
A total of just 3 actors were hired for the voiceover work in this film, 2 men and 1 woman. Ogata and Serizawa, the 2 young male leads, were performed by James Hong, who is now a very, very recognizable character actor from movies like Blade Runner or Big Trouble in Little China. But back then, Hong was in his mid-20s and he was just starting out as an actor. Now, James Hong says that the dialogue for the entire movie was recorded in one session that lasted about 5 hours, which is amazingly fast. He says that he and the other actors really had no clue what they were working on. They never saw the movie and had no idea that Raymond Burr was going to be in it. They recorded their dialogue actually not in a recording studio, but in an office while sitting at a table with a microphone. He remembers that the actors were locked up in a little room and told to read their parts, and sometimes the director would tell the actors to read a line a little bit faster, a little bit slower, so that later on, when it was all being cut together, they would have more than one take to choose from when trying to match the dialogue to the actors' lip movements. So if James Hong's memory is accurate, and we have no reason to think it wasn't, then that gives you an idea of the type of low-budget production this was. The irony is that in Japan, Godzilla was one of the most expensive movies in history at the time it was made.
Yeah, there are drawbacks in putting together a movie like this on the cheap. Although we can't be certain of it, in this scene it sounds as if there's 2 completely different actors that are doing voices for Serizawa and Emiko than in the rest of the movie. Perhaps after James Hong and the other actors had finished their work, somebody realized later on that they had overlooked this very crucial scene. It's possible that retakes or additional recording was done with different actors. The entire story hinges on this moment, so when Emiko promises to keep quiet and yet the difference is there in the voices, especially the male actor's voice, it's so distracting that it's easy to miss what the actors are saying. The other actor whose voice is heard throughout the film was Sammy Tong, and that's Sammy spelled S-A-M-M-E-E. Sammy Tong became a fairly recognizable character actor just a few years later. He was a Chinese laundryman in It's a Mad, 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 Mad World. And he also played the butler in the primetime series called Bachelor Father that starred John Forsythe. He committed suicide in the early 1960s and had claimed that he was being hunted by the Chinese mafia for gambling debts.
Now, James Hong says that he and Sammy Tong were hired because of their ability to do different voices. James Hong said, quote, "This was a very, very, very low budget production, and by hiring us, they could get their money's worth. Sammy did about 6 voices, and I did about 7. He did all the old men, and I did the younger guy roles, and we took care of them all. And amazingly, even though we couldn't see the film or the characters we were playing, everything fit perfectly." Well, almost.
Yeah, not too bad. There's long stretches where Steve Martin disappears from the action. It's too bad Dr. Yamane doesn't hold a press conference at his house so Steve could find a way to slip himself into the scene.
That's funny.
One of the reasons people think the dubbing in these movies is funny is the stilted English and mock Asian accents that the voice actors would often try to use to make the dialogue sound authentic.
Yeah, when I interviewed James Hong a few years ago about his experiences working on this film, he said that he thought that was one of the reasons that he and Sammy Tong were hired. He said both of us knew how to create an accent that was understandable to the general audience and still have the effect of sounding Asian. We didn't claim to be experts in that accent, but it served the purpose in that movie. There were so many American-made giant atomic monster movies in the 50s. A lot of them mirrored Godzilla in that they exploited people's fears and anxieties about the nuclear tests that were going on in the Nevada desert. One of the best of the American atomic monster movies is Them, which was directed by Gordon Douglas and came out in 1954. And I'm sure you've seen it. It's about giant ants that were mutated by the explosion of Trinity, the first atomic bomb in the New Mexico desert back in 1945. It's got a lot in common with Godzilla in the sense that the nuclear issue is treated in a very straightforward and serious way, and it's not what you'd really call an exploitation film. It's also really well made. It starred James Whitmore and James Arness, and the special effects of the giant ants were really nicely done.
Yeah, but most of the giant monster films of that era were not nearly as good. Some of them are a lot of fun, like the Bird Eye Gordon movies. You know, the Amazing Colossal Man Attacking Las Vegas is classic, and the big spider that's brought back to life by rock and roll music in Earth vs. a Spider. But, you know, these films have always been looked at as B movies, and Godzilla King of the Monsters is usually lumped into that same category. You can't be surprised that this would be the case. The ad campaign, which is used for King of the Monsters, is just like any other exploitation film of that era. You know, hyperbole sold the film, so when you see the trailer hyping dynamic violence and savage action and spectacular thrills, it's hard not to think B-movie.
The military used every man and machine available in an effort to stem the oncoming terror.
The producers of Godzilla King of the Monsters have been accused of having a political agenda and of cutting the film down to size to whitewash anti-American themes in the movie. One reason why I don't completely buy into this theory is, why did they stop there? If they had a political agenda, why wouldn't they have gone further to change the movie's politics instead of just softening them? A lot of American science fiction movies of that era have been interpreted as thinly veiled pro-America right-wing Cold War propaganda. The monsters are said to represent the Red Menace, and if they're not stopped, they'll take over the world. Even the ants in them have been interpreted as stand-ins for a Russian invasion. In a lot of those movies, the American military would save the day by developing a new super weapon. So if you overanalyze and perhaps read too much into it, you could say those films whitewashed the dangers of nuclear weapons because they were, in effect, saying that communism was more dangerous than the H-bomb. But the makers of this film really made no attempt to do anything like that. If you want to see an example of a Godzilla film that was turned into right-wing propaganda, go watch Godzilla 1985. When the American distributors recut that film for release in the States, they took a scene where a Russian naval officer tries to stop a nuclear launch, and they made him the villain. Through a little re-editing, they changed it so that he actually launches the missile at Tokyo. Raymond Burr's scenes were shot at a production house called Visual Drama, which was located in the old KFI radio building at the corner of Vermont Avenue and First Street in Los Angeles. There are a few different accounts of how long it took to film the new scenes with Raymond Burr. One story is that Raymond Burr's contract called for his work to be completed in one day, and in order to get everything done on time, the producers made him work 24 hours straight. The other versions of the events say that his scenes were shot over a period of 3 days or 5 days. In a 1994 biography that was written by Ona Hill, Raymond Burr said, quote, "The producers bought the rights to the Japanese picture, cut it, edited it, and shot my scenes in a tiny studio on Los Angeles Vermont Avenue. We had every scene in that small studio, including the mountains, the climbing scenes, the hospital scenes, the hotel scenes, with me looking out the window watching Godzilla destroying Tokyo. It was all done in that one little studio."
Let's go up on the hill.
Luckily for Steve, even when there's no press conference, he can at least find a crowd scene that he can blend into. And he's really a very lucky reporter because he just stumbled into the biggest news story in all of history, and he always seems to be in the right place and right in the middle of the action. I mean, here you can see him watching from a hill, at a safe distance, of course, just like the film's actual protagonist, so his presence seems quite natural, but when you think about it, it doesn't make any sense for him to even be there. I mean, he was not in the Amane house just a few moments earlier, so we're only left to think that maybe he was, walking through the neighborhood at the time and just happened to pick the same hill that the Amane family happened to go up and watch the action from.
Yeah, I think Raymond Burr deserved an Oscar for Best Actor inserted into a completed film made in another country. He does a respectable job most of the time. It's scenes like this one, though, where he's just kind of staring off into the distance, that his blank, expressionless stare really could have used a little more pathos. Another key player in the Americanization was a man named Paul Schreibman. who was a Hollywood lawyer. Now, Schreibman, who was 92 years old when he died in 2001, was a real old-school kind of Hollywood guy. I was lucky enough to interview him when I was writing my book, but the only place he would let me contact him was the old Friars Club in Beverly Hills, where he was still hanging out with Milton Berle in the 1990s. Now, Schreibman was not a humble man by any means, and he really claimed that it was he, and he alone, who discovered Godzilla. That may not be entirely true, but he did act as an intermediary between Toho and all the parties who owned the rights to this movie, and he formed a distribution company called the Godzilla Releasing Company that handled the film's release on the West Coast. It was Paul Schreibman who negotiated for Raymond Burr to appear in the movie as well. Right now I'd like to play a short excerpt from an interview that I did in 1995 with Paul Schreibman, just so you can get a feel for what kind of a guy he was and how he viewed his role in bringing Godzilla to America.
Godzilla was the first, and I saw it, and I'm the one that decided to launch it as a general release picture, and it worked. Nobody ever heard of Japanese films. This was the first, and really my launching it has really launched the whole industry. You needed to launch it in the American market. It just as a Japanese dubbed film would have the same value if it had an American star in it and some English. So I did it, and we rented a little studio down here on Vermont Street called Visual Drama, set up a set with Raymond Burr in it, and shot for 5 days, and then intercut all the scenes in the picture.
Hey, Steve.
Hi, Tomo.
What'd you run out of the meeting for?
Had to get this story off to the paper. Anything happen after I left?
Yes. They're making one last big effort to stop.
The big electrical barrier that protects Tokyo from Godzilla is one of the less convincing plot points in the Japanese version, and director Terry Morse came up with a more logical explanation for it. Instead of the government rushing to build these big metal towers and generators in no time flat, in this version the towers actually already exist, and the plan is to supercharge them with high voltage. This certainly made a much more believable scenario, because it's quite a stretch to think that the towers could have been built in just a couple of days.
But they still haven't explained how they know Godzilla will come ashore in Tokyo again in that very location.
The security officials ordered a general evacuation of all non-essential personnel.
I really like Raymond Burr's dialogue during the Tokyo attack, especially the way his narration sets the mood. And the screenplay for the American-made scenes was co-written by the director Terry Morse and a writer named Al C. Ward, who did a lot of film and especially TV work in the 50s and 60s. My friend Ted Newsom, who's a screenwriter and author and filmmaker, took a screenwriting class from Al C. Ward when he was teaching at California State University Northridge some years ago, and Al C. Ward actually told a story about his involvement in Godzilla. So I asked Ted to tell us that story.
Thank you, Steve. Cal State Northridge had some really neat teachers, some high visibility ones if you're a film buff. Sid Selko, who did Last Man on Earth, and Ben Brady, who did Star Trek and Outer Limits. But Al C. Ward was absolutely an unknown name to me. It was like a basic screenwriting class. And I got to know him because I was kind of a gadfly. And at the time, I had a potential assignment to do a thing called Hercules Recycled, which was taking the first two Steve Reeves Embassy pictures and putting them together and making a goofy comedy out of it, like What's Up, Tiger Lily? And I asked Al if he had any advice on it. He said, I got a story to tell you. He said when he was first starting out, some friends of his came to him and said, look, we bought the rights to this Japanese picture. Take a look at it, see what you think. And he said, yeah, well, it had all these good effects in it, but, the story probably just wouldn't play. So I wrote a new script, and they did this stuff. So we did it, and they said, so you want screen credit on these? He said, oh, no, good heavens, no, I don't want any credit on that thing. And they said, well, would you settle for a little less money in exchange for a percentage of this? He said, no, give me the cash. And then Al said, and that, of course, was the original Godzilla. And he looked pretty sheepish when he told that story.
Tokyo, time has been turned back 2 million years. This is my report as it happened.
This sequence is the most compelling part of the movie, and no matter what you might think of this version, love it or hate it, this is a piece of classic science fiction movie history. And it's interesting to note some of the stylistic changes that Terry Morse and his crew made in these scenes. When Godzilla comes ashore and approaches the electrical towers, This version has a few more moments of silence than in the Japanese cut, just before Godzilla touches the electrical towers. And I think it actually really is a bit more effective at building the tension just before the action starts to take place. These kinds of little changes were naturally made in the editing room.
The sound effects editor on this production was named George Roars, and like a lot of the other people who worked on this film, he had a pretty impressive resume. George Roars went on to do a lot of TV work in the 60s and 70s, including shows like Happy Days and The A-Team and Doogie Howser. And there was another person in the editing room who was just 24 years old at the time, and who just happened to be the son of the film's director. Terry Morse Jr. was the assistant editor on Godzilla King of the Monsters, and we're very fortunate to have him here to talk a little bit about his dad and his memories of working on this film. Welcome, Terry.
Thank you.
And we'd like to ask you a few questions about not only your father's work on the film, but we understand that you worked on the movie as well.
I did a little work on it. I was just breaking into the cutting room at the time, so I helped Dad with, I was an assistant editor and assistant sound effects editor and a gopher generally, but my career started in '54, and then later on I got into the Directors Guild.
Can you tell us how your father might have gotten the job to direct Godzilla?
Well, he had a reputation in Hollywood as a film doctor. People would come to him and say, "We got troubles here. Can you make some cuts? Can you rearrange things and salvage the picture so we can release it?" And he'd done that a couple of times, and that's how they came to him. And also, he was a director and an editor, both.
Well, can you just give us a little rundown of his career up to the point where he made Godzilla?
He was he started at First National in 1921. He was 16 years old, and just worked his way up to become an editor. Through the 20s, he was learning his craft. He worked as a cameraman, stills, assistant editor, all of that. He started editing at the end in the late 20s. I think 28 and 29 is when he started editing, and was under contract with Warner Brothers all through the 30s. And eventually, at the end of 1939, they let him direct some B pictures. B pictures are the second picture that will run alongside an A picture, and they're normally 45 to 50 minutes, maybe an hour long. And he did directed nine small features for Warner Brothers. One of them was with Ronald Reagan, a picture called Smashing the Money Ring.
Can you tell us what aspects of the production of Godzilla, in addition to directing the new scenes with Raymond Burr, that Terry Morse was in charge of?
Actually, he was in charge of everything. Joe Levine, the other producers were never around. He contacted a writer, and they conceived these scenes that could be intercut in the movie Gorgia. And he did everything. He directed, he edited together, supervised the dubbing, and brought people in like George Roars to help him on sound effects and Lee Osborne to help him on music. But he was in charge of everything.
Had Terry Morse ever done a science fiction picture before?
Not at that time. Mm-hmm. I don't think so, no.
So his reputation as what you called a film doctor was probably the reason why he was chosen, is that right?
Yeah, it was probably one of the reasons. Also the fact that he was an editor and a director, both, that he'd done both, so they needed somebody to have both those skills.
2 for 1.
That's right.
Did he ever express any attitude, his attitude towards science fiction or horror movies to you?
No, he just, at the time, none of us knew that it would become the picture it became. Mm-hmm. It was a real surprise.
And you mentioned some of the other people, like George Roars, the editor, and then there was a writer, and it was Terry Morse who brought these people into the production?
That's right.
Were they all people?
And the cameraman, people that he had worked with before and were looking for a short job. This only shot 3 to 4 days. So yeah, he did. He brought all these people together.
Mm-hmm. Now, you mentioned Joe Levine a few minutes ago. Was Joe the person who personally hired your father?
Yes.
Had they had any...
Embassy, I think it was Embassy Pictures.
That's right.
This is the first time they worked together.
You say that the other producers were kind of behind the scenes, are they?
Yeah, they might have been around, during the final dub, but really, my dad was the one that was front and center through all of this.
Okay. Approximately how much time and money and other resources was Terry Morse given to do this job?
He was given, I think, $10,000 at that time, which was a lot of money, to handle everything. His directing, his editing, following through on the dubbing, looping the actors. It was kind of a flat fee he made at that time.
$10,000, that's a bargain.
That is, and especially in today's market, but I really don't know what was spent on the shoot of the picture, or what Raymond Burr got or any of that.
Okay. Do you remember any details of the actual process by which the new version of the film was created?
The old film was, as you know, a completely made Japanese film, no subtitles at all. So first of all, they had to get a translator in to translate the whole picture, and then he had to sit down with the writer and conceive these scenes that could be intercut, and also write the narration that Raymond Burr did throughout the picture. That's how it all came together.
So the script that was written for Raymond Burr here is very memorable, and his line readings are so stark. I really admire the fact that he didn't just phone in the performance. I mean, you can see him sweating and trying his best to emote something.
Turned the heart of Tokyo into a sea of fire. Beneath the flames, thousands lie dead or
I don't know how Raymond Burr felt about this character, but he really did the best he could with it. He's playing a character who really isn't a character, who has no story, and that's probably not very easy to do.
What my dad did also, which was the most difficult thing in the picture, which was the most time-consuming, was trying to fit English dialogue into the lips of the Japanese actors and actresses. That was hard to do. They were speaking in Japanese, and we had to lay some English in there, and very hard. And you'll see there's parts in there where they really don't. They're not in sync. But he did the best he could, because he did not choose to do subtitles. So it's an all English picture, and I remember him fighting on that moviola, trying to get those words to fit into the mouths.
What raw materials were they given? Just a Japanese print?
They were given a composite print, also a dupe negative, and the original soundtracks. They were able to salvage the music, some of the sound effects, and we also augmented the sound effects with our sound effects here to build it up even more. That's all the elements they had to work with.
It's funny that you remember that, because that's one of the things that really stands out to me. In the original version, there really weren't a lot of hysterical cries and screams of pain and agony, and that was one of the things that was added, which I really like. Some people believe that Terry Morse and the others behind this production intentionally deleted references to the atomic bombings and depoliticized the movie for the American market. What's your take on that?
None at all. They just wanted to make a good horror movie, a good monster movie. That was the whole plan. Any references to the atom bomb were not even taken into consideration when my dad cut the picture.
There really hadn't been any other movies that I'm aware of that were ever done this way before, where you take a foreign film and completely recut it, insert a new actor, and basically make a new movie out of an old movie. Did he ever express his feelings about doing that? Did he think it was a crazy idea, or was it just this great challenge for him, or just a job?
It was mostly a challenge, and it was a job. You know, he can do a little directing and his editing, so he enjoyed it. He enjoyed the process.
I wonder if there was another movie he could have watched for any kind of inspiration as to, like, a template for how to do this kind of thing, but I can't think of one.
I can't either, and I think it's something that he and the writer worked together on, creating these new scenes, and also getting them match what was shot in Japan. Most of it was shot on the soundstage.
In the spring of 2006, you and I both attended a plaque dedication ceremony on the site where Raymond Burr's scenes were filmed. It's now an elementary school, but back in those days, it was a production house called Visual Drama. Is that correct?
That's right. It was a very small stage, and they had some offices in the front in some cutting rooms in the back, in the rear, where my dad worked. But it was a small facility.
Raymond Burr, in one of his interviews, once said that this was the smallest soundstage in Los Angeles. Do you think he was exaggerating?
He might have been, but it could be one of the smaller ones that are around.
Raymond Burr also claimed that all of his scenes were shot in a 24-hour period. Is that true?
That's not correct, because they worked at least 3 days, and I believe that Raymond Burr worked both on the stage and maybe some exterior scenes, too. It was a lot of work to do in just 3 or 4 days.
Tell us a little bit about your job on the film. How did you happen to get the job, and how long did you work on it, and what did you do exactly?
Well, I got the job because he's my dad. I was working at the time, but I would work on weekends and nights, just helping him as an assistant editor when he was in the editing process, and then helping with the sound effects editor, George Roars, laying in the sound effects. And then we did all the looping right there, like we're doing this recording here. We didn't have projection or loop lines as they do in the movies. We recorded it, and that's why it was tough to get the lip sync on it.
When you say you did the looping, was the dialogue already recorded at that point, and you were just matching it to the shots?
That's right. Well, we recorded it there at Visual Drama, and then we cut it in the cutting rooms back there, trying to get the English voices into the lips of the Japanese actors.
Were you present when any of the actors did the recording of the dialogue?
Yes, I was, yeah. We would do it wild ourselves to let the actor listen to, and then he would get a pacing on that, so he knew when to hit certain beats. And it's a difficult way to loop, but it was the only thing we could afford at the time.
Oh, definitely. This was a very low-budget project, it sounds.
Yeah, it was.
But at the same time, the personnel who worked on this low-budget project were not your typical B-movie cast of characters, both in front of the camera and behind it.
Yeah, we had good people, a good little crew, and of course Raymond Burr did a wonderful job.
Yeah, and Raymond Burr is a real trooper. This is a very unflattering scene for him with those bandages covering his face. I mean, suddenly he doesn't look like the big, imposing guy who was smoking a pipe. One of the actors who did a majority of the male voices in the film was James Hong, and he recalls actually recording all of the dialogue in basically one day. Does that sound accurate?
That's right. Mm-hmm. He came in, we hired him for a day, and he did all the different voice, the different actors' voice work in one day. I think, though, we were 2 or 3 days doing the recording, but we did him in one day.
Yeah, well, that's getting a lot of bang for your buck, isn't it?
That's right.
You say it took 3 days to shoot the new scenes, but how long did the post-production take?
About 3 to 4 weeks.
3 to 4 weeks.
Yeah, my dad was a very fast editor. He stood at a moviola. He didn't sit down. He stood there and knocked the scenes out, and he had it cut, in no time. Then there was a process of laying in the music and the additional sound effects, and also using their sound effects along with ours to come up with what we came up with.
Now, tell us a little bit about Terry Morse's career after Godzilla. He directed a few more films, didn't he?
Just a couple after that. He more or less went back into editing, film editing. He directed a picture with Nick Adams called Young Dillinger. Oh yeah, another one called Taffy and the Jungle Hunters. Those 2 pictures were the only 2 that he directed after Godzilla. He did some second unit directing. He worked with John Huston on The List of Adrian Messenger. I happened to be the second assistant director on the set at that time.
And he retired when, in the late 60s, early 70s?
Yeah, in the 70s he retired.
Okay. This was most certainly Terry Morse's most famous film, would you agree?
Yes, he directed 18 movies, and this is the one that really stands out there.
How did he feel about that? Did he ever talk about Godzilla at all in the years after?
Well, he was actually he was surprised that it did as well as it did. He would be very happy today knowing what it started, all the Godzilla movies. But yeah, he was proud of that. It was a real accomplishment.
Thanks a lot, Terry.
Okay.
So again, we've come full circle and we're back to where the story began in the triage unit with Steve on a stretcher. There's some clever reworking of the Japanese footage here to stick Raymond Burr into a scene that for once isn't a news conference or a crowd of people running away from the monster. So instead of Emiko telling this horrible secret of the oxygen destroyer to Ogata, it's Emiko and Ogata telling the secret to Steve Martin. So even if the main character can't personally go out and save the day, he can at least urge his friends to go out and do it. I love the way he reads the line, "If you can help, you must."
Yeah, this scene is much better handled than earlier in the film, with the body doubles and cutting to footage of the Japanese actors. The sight lines are much more natural, and the body doubles move their heads and change their posture to make it look as if they're actually speaking to each other. The Japanese footage also works perfectly. Emiko is looking down where Steve would be, and the dubbing matches her lip movements quite nicely.
Sit down.
The most glaring problem with the way this movie was written is Steve's friendship with Serizawa, as we've mentioned before, and the fact that they never meet, but I don't think I would notice it so much if it wasn't brought up again and again. You know, Steve says, if only I could see him, as sort of a preemptive answer to the question, why don't you go and ask him to use the oxygen destroyer? But I wonder if the two men are really friends. Why doesn't Serizawa visit Steve in the hospital? You know, Emiko doesn't love Serizawa the way he loves her, and I think Serizawa doesn't like Steve the way Steve likes him either. Another thing that James Hong remembered when he was talking about working on this film was that in some scenes he actually had to talk to himself because he was playing, you know, two characters. And here's one of those scenes. When Serizawa and Ogata are struggling with each other, you can hear Hong's voice saying, you know, we must have the formula, we must. And then he says, let go. And then you can hear the Japanese dialogue again when Ogata says, Serizawa-san. So it's as if the movie shifts back and forth between two different realities, different languages, different voices. And closer to the end, you're going to hear Dr. Yamane, while he's doffing his hat on the boat, say the word Serizawa. And it's actually the voice of Takashi Shimura, the Japanese actor. And it sounds totally different than the dubbed voice you've heard up till then. And yet it's not distracting, and it doesn't take the viewer out of the story. Perhaps I've seen the movie so many times I can't be objective about it, but I wonder what I would have thought if I were watching this for the first time. You know, would I think it's a mistake? It occurs so many times throughout the film that it becomes kind of a motif, intended or not. And I can't really think of another movie where this kind of thing happens, can you?
No.
There's more good writing in this scene, and one line of dialogue in particular that seems to be remembered by a lot of people who've seen this movie.
Even though the dialogue here has been shortened somewhat, the English translation retains the basic points of the original Japanese dialogue, and in fact, the writing is excellent. You know, Ogata's line, you have your fears, which can become reality, and you have Godzilla, which is reality. It actually outshines Honda's original dialogue. It's one of the most memorable lines in any science fiction film.
Fear which might become reality, and you have Godzilla, which is reality.
Over the years, some people have wondered how the English language spelling of Godzilla's name came about. Sometimes it's assumed that Joseph E. Levine, the executive producer of this film, came up with that spelling, and probably because of the fact that the people who worked for him are the ones who decided to call Godzilla the King of the Monsters. But Godzilla is really just an English transliteration of the Japanese name Gojira. Because of the different ways that certain consonants are formed between English and Japanese, it comes out sounding a little bit differently in English, and Godzilla is a fairly logical way to spell it.
And there's pretty conclusive evidence that the word Godzilla was thought out before the film was even sold in America. You know, Toho used to publish English language sales brochures showing all the films available for international distribution, and this film was listed as Godzilla. And the contract that Edmund Goldman signed when he bought the rights in September of '55 also called it Godzilla with this spelling. Some people think of this film as a classic, and others see it as a bastardization, as we've said. But no matter what anybody thinks, it's this version that deserves a lot of the credit for putting Godzilla on the map. What if nobody had bothered to do this? What if nobody ever thought of this strange idea to film new scenes and transform this Japanese film into an American one?
Quite honestly, I think that that's exactly what would have happened, that this film would have sat on the shelf and no one would have released it here. That, you know, to this point in Hollywood, you know, no one thought about Japanese films. No one had ever released a Japanese film commercially here and had any kind of success with it. So the fact is that there was no precedent for releasing a Japanese film. Without some kind of alteration, it probably couldn't have gotten released. But once it was and it became successful, that opened the eyes of the film community in Hollywood to the point that, hey, here's some kind of films that are, we can do something with, and they're commercially exploitable. So that itself kind of also fed Toho and gave them the impetus to actually make more of these films. So maybe perhaps without Joseph E. Levine and all these people with their idea on how to change this film and make it marketable and accessible to U.S. audiences, we may never have had a large number of the science fiction films which we've grown to love over the years.
And we certainly don't want to sound like we're apologizing for this film. A lot of the alterations that were made had the cumulative effect of watering down the theme of the movie. The anti-nuclear message is still there, but is enough of it still there to resonate with the audience? Some of the movie critics who reviewed the film back in 1956 had no trouble decoding the metaphor, but to the general audience, the notion that Godzilla was supposed to represent the atomic bomb was lost, not just because of all the material that was changed or deleted, but because the American audience could never have understood what Ishiro Honda was telling them anyway. Pearl Harbor aside, World War II was never fought on U.S. soil, and the only Americans who had any idea of what sort of devastation Japan might have suffered through were probably soldiers who had been there in the occupation or after the war. The Red Scare and fears of atomic warfare and mutation, the kind of anxieties that American big monster movies of the 50s played upon, those were imaginary fears of things that the audience had never experienced firsthand. So the imagery of Honda's film, much of which remains intact in this version, the destruction, the hospitals filled with the dead, you couldn't expect a 1950s American audience to really understand what it meant because we hadn't lived through it. We didn't know the kind of defeat and sorrow and suffering that Godzilla showed. So to us, it was just another monster movie in a long line of monster movies.
The people who made this film have said that they were not politically motivated. Richard Kay, the producer, admitted that his main concern back in the 50s was not whether a movie was any good. He just wanted something that he could sell a lot of tickets with. So you can understand why why they did what they did. They gave the movie an American frame of reference and a main character for the audience with which to identify.
And the fact that so much material was cut out probably had to do with economics as much as anything. A film like this in the 50s was usually about 75 to 80 minutes long. The Japanese version was 98 minutes long, much too long for an American monster movie in those days. The myth that Raymond Burr had shot his scenes in Japan was so widespread that even some people in Hollywood believed it. One person who believed it apparently was the actor Myron Healy, who himself appeared in another Toho monster film a few years later, Varan the Unbelievable, also through newly inserted scenes. My friend Ted Newsom tells a funny story about this.
Myron Healy was a character actor who worked a lot in the 40s, 50s, and 60s. He was in The Unearthly with John Carradine, a rather unlikely surly hero, but that's the way he was. Played Dillinger on an episode of Gangbusters, I think. Was in Wyatt Earp with Hugh O'Brien. He was Doc Holliday. Anyway, in 1988, there was a writer's strike in Hollywood, so I was walking a picket line. And I happened to be walking next to Myron Healy, who was also a member of the Writers Guild. He was a writer in addition to primarily being an actor. So, I'm liking hearing old stories from old Hollywood guys. I just listened to them for an hour and naturally steered the conversation over to something important, i.e. Varan the Unbelievable, which was a monster film that he did in the 60s. And Myron Healy said, yeah, Varan the Unbelievable, yeah. I was doing a Perry Mason once. I was talking to Ray Burr. And I said, Ray, you got the better deal. And Ray said, what do you mean? And he said, well, you got to do Godzilla and you got to spend 2 months in Japan. I did Varan the Unbelievable and spent a week in Bronson Canyon. Well, it's a funny story, and I have no idea what Raymond Burr said, because as Steve has pointed out here, Raymond Burr most assuredly did not spend 2 months vacationing in Japan.
Raymond Burr's performance in this last scene is maybe not the top acting that he's done in this film. He just sort of stares blank-faced straight ahead, and it kind of looks like he might even be facing the wrong direction. It was probably pretty difficult to pretend that you're standing next to other actors who filmed their scenes 2 years ago, but yeah, here he looks just tired, and maybe it's the after effects of just getting out of the hospital. But scenes like this make you wonder if the story about Burr filming all of his scenes in one 24-hour block might be true after all.
So Ed, when did you first see this film, Godzilla King of the Monsters, and what was your reaction to it? How old were you?
Yeah, well, as we kind of hinted about earlier, I think I was like 6 or 7 years old at that time, and Godzilla was supposed to be showing on late night TV, the 10:30 movie, and it had gotten a lot of publicity in a newspaper and on TV that week, but they never showed you what Godzilla looked like, so I didn't know what it was. I just knew it was a monster. And I'd heard from other friends of mine who'd seen it that it was a monster movie, so okay, it's kind of interesting. So I begged my parents to stay up and watch it, and I got special permission, but I was kind of scared about what it's supposed to be like because I had no idea. So I'm sitting there on the couch, right up against my brother because I'm a little bit scared, and as the film is going on, it's pretty interesting, but it's kind of creepy, and especially once it got to the typhoon scene, it was so intense and scary for me that right as you see the crushed helicopter, they cut the commercial, and as soon as they did that, I just kind of looked at my brother and said, well, I'm going to bed. And so I never got to see Godzilla. I went to bed just before he actually appeared, so I had to wind up waiting another almost 7 or 8 years before I got to see the entire film for the first time. After I talked to my brother the next day, I found out that Godzilla was actually this gigantic dinosaur, and he breathed fire, and it just sounded so fantastic. I was really pretty upset that I went to bed and missed it all. But I did get to see Godzilla, I think a year or two later, King Kong vs. Godzilla, when that came out. That wound up starting me down this path that has led me here today. And how about you?
I can thank my mother. I guess I have a strange mother. She grew up on monster movies, and actually she saw this film when it came out in 1956 in a theater, and she always tells the story about how she went to the theater and she wanted to see Godzilla, and she kept waiting there for the monster show to show up, and she got really bored, so she kept going up to the lobby to call her friends on the payphone or smoke cigarettes, and she thought Raymond Burr was the most boring guy she'd ever seen. When I finally saw it on television, I pretended to go to bed and waited until my mom went to bed. And I knew it was coming on, I think it must have been after midnight. And I stayed up, into the wee hours, and I turned on the TV and watched it with the sound on very, very low. But it scared the bejesus out of me, probably because it was so dark, and the music in that scene is so psychologically disturbing. I think it haunted me for a while.
That really did it for me too. I think the music more than anything kind of creates the mood in that scene, and that really, really made a deep impression on me.
As you watch both versions of this film, you're going to notice many other references to nuclear weapons that were cut out of this version. The scene on the train where the woman says, "I hope I didn't survive Nagasaki for nothing." The argument between Ogata and Dr. Yamane, where Ogata compares Godzilla to the H-bomb. The scene during Godzilla's rampage where the mother clutches her children. That's in this version, but the dialogue isn't translated, and so on and so forth. But then again, during Dr. Yamane's big speech, he makes it plain Godzilla was resurrected due to the repeated experiments of the H-bomb. And even though Steve Martin never makes the same connection, he talks of people dying of shock and strange burns, and he describes Tokyo as a smoldering memorial to the unknown. And back in the days of duck and cover drills and air raid sirens, I think people would have known what he was talking about.
Just like Ogata's memorable dialogue in the last scene, Raymond Burr's summation of the film is a great piece of writing. Dr. Yamane's speech, "If we keep testing nuclear bombs, another Godzilla will return," that was cut out, and while it's a shame that the core message of Honda's film was removed, it's still a somber and respectful way to wrap up the film, paying homage to Serizawa. Considering that Serizawa's suicide was not clearly foreshadowed in this version like it was in Honda's, it's much more of a surprise, and it's kind of a downer, so this was a more positive spin which made sense for American audiences.
Well, we hope you've enjoyed this overview of the movie and our appreciation of all the people who helped to bring it to America. Now that the director's cut of Godzilla is widely available outside of Japan, it's easy to compare the two versions and to nitpick the US cut. But remember that Godzilla King of the Monsters was unique in its day. It was the first of its kind, and it started an international pop culture phenomenon that continues to this day.